Microstrategy's strategy was buy as much Bitcoin as you can and buy it with equity and debt. We borrowed money. We borrowed $2.2 billion at a blended interest rate of like 2% or 1.8%. So we borrowed cheap money while money was cheap, and we bought Bitcoin. Now people are saying that's stupid because Bitcoin was trading up and then it traded down. At the end of the day, if your time horizon is a decade or longer, if you can borrow the money for longer than 5 or 6 years and you can hold it through the volatility, then raising cheap money, grabbing billions of dollars at low interest, and then investing in a scarce, desirable asset that's got sort of a technology appeal and holding it for a long period of time, that's going to be a good strategy. That's why our stock is outperforming Bitcoin. That's why we're outperforming all the enterprise software companies, all the big tech companies. And the reason Bitcoin's outperforming all the other asset classes is because it's scarce, it's desirable, it's technical. No one's going to write a piece of software to make gold better. You're not going to put gold on a billion iPhones.
Michael Saylor is perhaps the biggest institutional Bitcoin bull in the space. In his latest interview, he breaks down how the current combination of macroeconomic events is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build generational wealth. What many do not know about Michael Saylor is that besides for being Microstrategy CEO and a huge Bitcoin bull, he's also extremely smart. He double majored in aeronautic and astronautic engineering at MIT. On top of this, he's been an incredibly successful investor, being an early stage investor in many of the massive tech stocks, Google, Amazon, Apple, and Facebook. This is why when Saylor speaks, everyone listens. Make sure to stick around to the end of the video where Saylor explains why his massive investments into Bitcoin, both personally and institutionally, is not a high conviction play, but really just the most logical thing to do when approaching a problem as an engineer. Also, only a small percentage of my viewers are actually subscribed. If you enjoy finance content, consider subscribing or liking the video. It's free and can always change your mind.
I think the real issue here is, do you have an engineering mentality and reason from first principles, or are you simply complying with the norms of society and conventional wisdom that you grew up with? People say things and they repeat these bromides and they give you a simple rule of thumb, like, oh, the rule of thumb is 60-40 stock bond portfolio, or the rule of thumb is stay diversified, or the rule of thumb is buy the biggest house you can and get the biggest mortgage and you'll be fine. Well, those are all fine, assuming that you have equilibrium and you don't have a radical state change. For example, all those rules of thumb they don't work if you're a Jew in Nazi Germany in the 30s. Buying a house to store value doesn't work, right? Trust the government, keep your nose clean. That doesn't work. Buying stocks, that's an interesting thing in the US when the money supply expands at 7% a year. Do you think stocks work if you bought stocks in Zimbabwe or stocks in Cuba or stocks in North Korea or stocks in Argentina or stocks fill in the blank? They don't work. What happens when the government crashes? You think stocks work in Sri Lanka? No. How does stocks work in Russia in the 90s? Well, the entire currency collapsed, the government collapsed, everybody lost everything. So diversification doesn't work when every single thing you own in your portfolio is correlated. For example, you can buy any company you want in Germany in 1944. How's your diversification going to work? How about buy anything you want in the city I'm about to drop a nuclear bomb on? How's that going to work, right? So diversification is a bromide. Stocks, bonds are a bromide. Real estate as monetizable property, it's a bromide. It only works if you can trust them. How's it going to work when I actually get elected mayor and I just seize your entire property to make into a pet hospital for the good of the people? So the point really is, all of these are simple rules of thumb that allow people to not think for themselves. Are you moving your entire family to Zimbabwe right now because you have conviction? Or let me reverse it. Why is it that you don't move your entire family to Zimbabwe, sell all your stuff, and buy the Zimbabwe dollar? Why is it that you don't do that? Because of conviction, or just because it seems quite obvious to you that's not a good idea? The point really is, you put on one pair of glasses, you've got one pair of AirPods right now. You're looking at me through one screen. You're using one microphone. That's a one microphone. Like, you trust it? Is that conviction? seems kind of scary. Why don't you diversify? Why don't you use 10 microphones? The point really is things in your life. Do you drive in 10 cars at the same time or one car at one time? Do you drive down one street? Aren't you afraid that you're driving down one street? Do you take a different way? So my point really is ultimately, if you're a rational individual, when you use knives, do you have copper knives, wooden knives, steel knives, aluminum knives, rubber band knives, diamond knives, because you're afraid to commit to the right knife? So ultimately, what I'm saying here is an engineer would look at this and say, I use glass for my windows. I don't use aluminum for my windows because I can't see through the aluminum. People used to use wooden beams. Steel beams work better, right? I use copper for wires because electricity goes through copper better. I don't use aluminum for wires. Am I a radical, convicted, fanatic investor? Or am I just like a rational person that uses copper for wires because copper works better? And my point here is you live in a society and things are going awry. If you did live in a country and the food supply was cut off, the electricity got turned off, the currency collapsed, and there were riots in the streets, would you still just kind of hang out and use the same rules of thumb you've been using? Or would you say, I think I'm going to exit via the airport where there are no riots if I can get on that plane, and I'm going to go somewhere else not because I'm convicted. No, I'm just going to do it because I'm an intelligent human being. And I notice that it's getting uncomfortable where I am right now. And so that's the way I see it. It's just thinking for yourself using reason. Your choice is you want to hold $1 billion of property in Zimbabwe or North Korea. You want to hold $1 billion of property in LA. You want to hold $1 billion of gold in a vault. You want to hold $1 billion worth of a stock in a Chinese company, Alibaba, trading on the Shanghai Stock Exchange, subject to the Chinese government. Do you want to hold $1 billion worth of Bitcoin? What do you want to hold, right? Why do you feel that way? Once you understand money, you understand Bitcoin is engineered money and it's engineered without defects. Once you look at your life, you realize you got a balance sheet. You got to actually allocate your wealth to portions of the balance sheet, and assumptions you used to be able to make about bonds, they don't work anymore. Assumptions you used to make about stocks, they don't work anymore. Assumptions you made about property, you own a yoga studio. I get elected mayor and I tell you point blank, I think yoga is dangerous. People should not be able to do yoga. It's an abomination in the eyes of God for the next decade. You still have the same view of your value of your yoga studio? Or are you going to say, maybe I can repurpose it to something that's politically correct? Or you say, maybe I'm just going to sell it and go someplace where I'm less likely to get canceled, right? As a business. This is not radical conviction. We like to think the people that came to the United States were crazy, but they're not crazy. The reason they came to the US is because they were the wrong religion or the wrong ethnic group in a country that had an encroaching authoritarian government. And at some point, the Catholics decided the Protestants aren't allowed to own property or live. And at some point, the Protestants decided Catholics, they can't own property. And if it turns out that you happen to be a Catholic, you're going to be drawn and quartered, right? And the skin will be flayed off your skin. You know, my family came from Lucerne, Switzerland in 1730, and they were Palatines. They were Swiss Protestants. Why would you get on a wooden ship, travel for 12 weeks, risk 5% chance of death to get out of your hometown? And the answer is because it was a certain death, a certain slow death. If I stuck around. That is the story of America for hundreds of years. Every sect was leaving, emigrating because the life was hopeless where they stayed. And I don't know, I call that radical conviction as much as I would just say at some point they realized that it was riskier to stand where they are than it is to move somewhere else. And if I look at Bitcoin, I'm not going to say, let me say it this way. If you're in a city in the middle of Africa taken over by a dictator who's going to murder everybody next Tuesday, I would say convert all your wealth to Bitcoin and leave. If you happen to live in Florida or Texas and you've got a comfortable life and family and you expect to be there for the next 30 years and you want to own some land, a building, a restaurant, and some Bitcoin, I say, okay, diversified portfolio, I guess that's fine for you. And if you're somewhere else where, if you're sitting in a country where the bank is about to freeze your assets and devalue them 10 to 1 and trickle them back to you over the next 20 years, I would say on the margin, yeah, you probably should convert them all to Bitcoin and get them out of a custodian, because the volatility of Bitcoin and the risk of Bitcoin is a lot less than the risk of trusting the bank and trusting the government and trusting the local currency. So ultimately, everyone's got to decide just how risky is their macroeconomic situation. And if you happen to be wealthy living in Manhattan and you're living off a trust fund, you might not have a problem. You might think it's okay, but, ask people that fled Cuba or North Korea how okay it was, right? Everybody's got to make their decision. The lucky thing is you have an option. Today, you have an option. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you didn't have an option to move all of your wealth onto a crypto asset network. And what Bitcoin represents is hope. It's hope for a refugee that's going to flee a hostile regime, a hostile banking system, a hostile environment. And if you're one of the 3 or 4 billion people that has no hope otherwise, then for you, it's really a utilitarian entitlement. For people that are rich in the Western world, it's just an investment option for them until they get sensitized to this issue. And the more you get sensitized, then you start to realize it's a moral imperative, even if not for you. Maybe you're rich and safe. It's a moral imperative for you to support it for people that are in Africa or South America or fleeing from a war zone or fleeing from a hostile regime that's going to confiscate 20, 30, 40% of their property every year forever. So even if you don't think you need it in order to protect your family for the next 30 years, seems to me like you might want to support it just because it's the right thing for humanity. And that's where I come down on this situation.